Manila, Philippines, January 3, 1945. Behind the barbed wire of Santo Tomas internment camp, 32-year-old Lieutenant Dorothy Chen of the United States Army Nurse Corps sat in the shade of a gnarled acacia tree, her knitting needles clicking with a rhythm that seemed almost absurdly cheerful. The other internees had grown accustomed to her presence there each afternoon, creating what appeared to be an endlessly complicated Afghan in colors that clashed so violently they made the eyes water. Pale yellow against muddy brown, sickly green beside garish orange. The guards who patrolled the perimeter barely glanced at her anymore. Just another foolish American woman, they assumed, trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy by creating something utterly useless. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What none of them realized was that Dorothy's seemingly ridiculous knitting project contained a precisely coded map of the entire camp, guard rotations, supply storage locations, and structural vulnerabilities, all woven into a pattern so deliberately ugly that no one would ever think to look at it twice. Dorothy had been interned at Santo Tomas for nearly 3 years, since the fall of Manila in January 1942. She had been among the last American medical personnel to evacuate Sternberg Hospital before the occupation forces arrived, and in the chaos of those final days, she had made the choice to stay behind with her patients rather than attempt an escape to Bataan. That decision had earned her the respect of her fellow prisoners and the suspicion of the guards, who noted in their records that Lieutenant Chen seemed remarkably calm for someone who had just lost her freedom. What they did not know was that before the occupation, Dorothy had spent 2 years working in military intelligence, recruited because of her unique background. Born in San Francisco to a Chinese immigrant father and an American mother, she had grown up speaking both Cantonese and English, learning to move between cultures with an ease that made her invaluable when tensions with Japan began escalating in the late 1930s. The army had trained her in basic cryptography and intelligence gathering, skills that seemed almost worthless when she found herself behind barbed wire, watching the Japanese forces consolidate their control over Manila. But Dorothy Chen was nothing if not patient, and she understood something that many of her fellow internees did not quite grasp. This imprisonment would not last forever. Eventually, American forces would return to the Philippines, and when they did, they would need every scrap of intelligence about Japanese positions, resources, and capabilities that the prisoners could provide. The question was how to preserve that information in a way that would survive searches, confiscations, and the general deprivations of camp life. The answer came to her during her 3rd month of internment, when she watched a guard confiscate a diary from Margaret Harrison, a missionary's wife who had been documenting conditions in the camp. The guard had flipped through the pages with growing anger before tearing the book apart, scattering the pages across the dusty ground. Margaret had wept, not for her own loss, but for the loss of the record she had been keeping. "Someone needs to remember this," she had said through her tears. "Someone needs to remember what they did to us." That night, lying on her thin mattress in the women's dormitory, Dorothy had stared at the ceiling and thought about the problem. Written records could be found and destroyed. Verbal reports could be forgotten or confused over time. What she needed was a method of recording information that was simultaneously permanent, portable, and completely invisible to her captors. Something so mundane that it would never attract suspicion. She looked down at her hands in the darkness, remembering her grandmother teaching her to knit when she was 7 years old. "Your fingers remember what your mind forgets," her grandmother had said, guiding her small hands through the complex patterns of traditional Chinese knotwork. "Every stitch tells a story if you know how to read it." The next morning, Dorothy approached Ellen Winters, a 58-year-old English teacher from Ohio who had been known before the occupation for her extraordinary memory and her hobby of cataloging the birds of Luzon. "Ellen, I need your help with something," Dorothy said quietly as they stood in the breakfast line, waiting for their ration of thin rice porridge, "something that needs to stay between us." Ellen studied her face for a long moment. "What kind of help?" "The kind that might matter when our boys come back." Dorothy paused, choosing her words carefully. "I need someone who can observe and remember details, guard rotations, storage locations, structural weaknesses, someone whose movements around camp won't attract attention. Ellen's expression barely changed, but Dorothy saw the flash of understanding in her eyes. "I've been watching birds for 40 years, Lieutenant. I know how to observe without being observed. What are you planning to do with this information?" "Preserve it." Dorothy glanced around to ensure no guards were within earshot. "In a format they'll never think to look at." Over the following weeks, the two women developed a system. Ellen would spend her days moving around the camp, using her age and apparent frailty as camouflage. She would sit near the fence line, ostensibly watching for birds, while actually counting paces between guard posts and noting the times of patrol changes. She would volunteer for work details, memorizing the layouts of storage facilities and noting which buildings had structural damage from American bombings before the surrender. She would engage guards in halting conversation, using her limited Japanese to ask innocent-seeming questions that revealed information about troop movements and supply conditions. Each evening, Ellen would meet Dorothy in the shade of the acacia tree, and they would have what appeared to be casual conversation about trivial matters. "Remember that cardinal I saw near the east fence yesterday?" Ellen might say. "It was perched on that damaged post, the one that's leaning about 15 degrees, the one that's exactly 87 paces from the main gate." Dorothy would nod, her needles never stopping their steady rhythm. "How lovely. I should use that rust color in my Afghan. Right next to this section here." She would point to a specific spot in her knitting, and Ellen would look, memorizing the pattern that was emerging. 2 pearl stitches. 3 knit, 1 dropped, 4 knit, 2 pearl. The code they developed was elegant in its simplicity. Each stitch type represented a different category of information. Knit stitches were structures. Pearl stitches were personnel. Dropped stitches indicated vulnerabilities. The colors represented different areas of the camp, laid out roughly according to the actual geography. The number of stitches in sequence provided measurements, times, and quantities. To anyone else, it looked like Dorothy was simply terrible at following a pattern, constantly making mistakes and choosing colors that clashed horribly. In reality, every single stitch was precisely placed, every color change deliberately calculated. By March 1943, Dorothy's Afghan had grown to nearly 2 meters long, and it contained detailed intelligence about the entire Santo Tomas complex. The northwest corner was represented by a particularly garish section of yellow and orange, indicating the location of the main administrative building, guard barracks, and ammunition storage. A series of dropped stitches along one edge documented the patrol pattern of the night watch, showing a gap of approximately 11 minutes between rounds at the northeast corner. A stretch of muddy brown stitches encoded the measurements of the main gate's hinges and the fact that the left hinge had developed a visible crack from metal fatigue. But Dorothy's project attracted an unexpected complication in the form of Sergeant Takashi Hayashi, a 35-year-old guard who had been assigned to Santo Tomas after being wounded during the fighting on Guadalcanal. Hayashi walked with a pronounced limp, the result of shrapnel wounds that had ended his combat service, but left him functional enough for garrison duty. Unlike many of his fellow guards, who treated the internees with casual cruelty or indifference, Hayashi maintained a careful neutrality that some prisoners found almost more unsettling than outright hostility. He first approached Dorothy on an afternoon in late April, standing at a respectful distance from the acacia tree. "That is a very unusual pattern you are making," he observed in careful English. Dorothy looked up, her heart rate accelerating despite her calm expression. "Thank you, Sergeant. I enjoy working with colors." Hayashi tilted his head, studying the Afghan. "My mother was a weaver in Kyoto before the war. She worked at a textile factory making obi sashes for kimono." He paused. "She would say that good weaving is like good poetry. Every element must have purpose. Nothing is accidental." Dorothy felt Ellen sitting nearby, tense almost imperceptibly. "Sometimes accidents create interesting patterns," she replied carefully. "I make many mistakes." "Perhaps." Hayashi's expression remained neutral. "Or perhaps what seems like mistakes to one eye is intention to another." He nodded politely and continued his patrol, leaving Dorothy's hands trembling slightly as she tried to continue her work. That evening, In the privacy of the women's dormitory, Ellen whispered urgently, "He knows. We need to destroy it." Dorothy shook her head. "He suspects, maybe. But he doesn't know what he's looking at. If we destroy it now, that confirms there's something worth hiding. We continue, but I'll be more careful." For the next several months, Dorothy modified her routine. She worked on the Afghan less frequently and in more public locations where multiple guards could observe her. She deliberately added sections that were simply random stitches with no encoded meaning, making the overall pattern even more chaotic and difficult to decipher. She began a second, much smaller project, a simple scarf in regulation colors, which she worked on whenever Sergeant Hayashi was nearby. But Hayashi continued to watch her, and Dorothy continued to observe him in return. She noticed that he frequently volunteered for the dawn patrol when the light was best for reading. She saw him helping an elderly internee carry water when the woman's bucket had developed a leak. She watched him intervene when a younger guard was preparing to strike a prisoner who had accidentally stepped too close to a restricted area. By December 1943, living conditions in Santo Tomas had deteriorated significantly. American submarine warfare had begun severely disrupting Japanese supply lines, and those disruptions were felt immediately by the prisoners. Daily rations were cut from barely adequate to actively insufficient. The internees organized a secret gardening project in a corner of the compound that was screened from the main guard tower, growing vegetables in soil they enriched with carefully hoarded compost. Dorothy contributed to this effort when she could, but her primary focus remained her knitting project, which had now grown large enough that she had to fold it carefully to carry it between locations. In January 1944, exactly 2 years after the fall of Manila, the camp received news through a clandestinely operated radio that American forces had begun their island-hopping campaign across the Pacific. The information spread through the internee population like electricity, providing hope that had been in desperately short supply. But it also made the guards more nervous and unpredictable, aware that their period of dominance might be approaching its end. It was during this tense period that Sergeant Hayashi approached Dorothy again, this time in the early morning when few other prisoners were awake. "Lieutenant Chen," he said quietly, "I need to speak with you. Privately." Dorothy's mind raced through possibilities, none of them good. "Of course, Sergeant." They walked to a corner of the compound that was visible to the guard tower, but out of earshot of other internees. Hayashi stood stiffly, his expression troubled. "I have observed you for many months now. Your knitting project, it is not what it appears to be." Dorothy forced herself to meet his eyes steadily. "I don't know what you mean, Sergeant. It's just a way to pass the time." Hayashi shook his head. "I told you my mother was a weaver. I learned from her how to read patterns, how to see intention in what others might think is chaos." He paused, and Dorothy saw genuine conflict in his face. "What you are creating is not decoration. It is documentation." The silence stretched between them. Dorothy calculated rapidly. Denial would insult his intelligence. Admission could mean execution. "I'm a nurse, Sergeant," she finally said. "I document what I observe. It's what I was trained to do, even in violation of regulations, even knowing the penalty." Dorothy straightened her shoulders, especially then. Because someone needs to remember. Someone needs to bear witness to what happens in places like this. Hayashi was quiet for a long moment, his eyes distant. "Do you know why I was assigned here, Lieutenant, after Guadalcanal?" "Because you were wounded." "No." He shook his head. "Because I protested the treatment of prisoners on Guadalcanal. I saw men who had surrendered being executed. I saw suffering that served no military purpose. I spoke against it to my commanding officer." He paused, his jaw tight. "That kind of complaint is not career advancing in the Imperial Army, so they gave me this assignment, where I could guard American civilians and cause no trouble." Dorothy studied his face, seeing the truth there. "Then you understand why I do what I do." "I understand." Hayashi met her eyes. "But understanding does not change the situation. If your project is discovered by others, you will be executed. And I will be executed for not reporting it." He paused. "So I have a proposal." Dorothy's heart hammered, but she kept her voice level. "I'm listening. Continue your work. But make it less obvious. I will ensure that when inspections happen, I am the one who examines your possessions." He took a breath. "And when the American forces return to Manila, as we both know they eventually will, you will testify that I treated prisoners with correct behavior, that I followed the rules of warfare. You're asking me to vouch for you at war crimes trials." Hayashi nodded slowly. "I am asking you to remember that not all soldiers on either side are the same, that some of us tried to maintain honor even when those around us abandoned it." Dorothy extended her hand. "You have my word, Sergeant. If I survive to testify, I will tell them exactly what you've done here." They shook hands, a gesture that could have gotten them both shot if the wrong guard had witnessed it. From that moment, Dorothy had an unlikely ally in her documentation project. Hayashi would warn her when surprise inspections were planned, giving her time to hide the Afghan in locations he had quietly indicated were safe. He would ensure that his patrol routes gave Ellen cover for her observation activities. And in ways both subtle and overt, he worked to improve conditions for the internees within the strict limits of his authority. But even with Hayashi's protection, life in Santo Tomas grew increasingly harsh as 1944 progressed. By September, the daily rice ration had been cut to barely 300 grams per person, supplemented only by whatever the internees could grow or scrounge. Dorothy noticed that her clothes hung loosely on her frame, and she had to add new stitches to her project carefully because her hands sometimes trembled from hunger-induced weakness. The Afghan, paradoxically, continued to grow more detailed, even as the internees grew thinner, documenting the arrival of new guards, changes in patrol patterns, and the construction of new defensive positions as the Japanese military prepared for the inevitable American assault. Ellen Winters, meanwhile, had developed an extraordinary network of observation. Working with 3 other elderly women who all shared an interest in birds and gardening, she had created a system where different members of her group would observe different sections of the camp, then share their findings through conversations that appeared entirely innocent. "Did you see that lovely egret near the southeast corner this morning?" Might actually mean that a supply truck had arrived at the ammunition depot and unloaded 17 crates. Ellen would then encode this information through her evening conversations with Dorothy, who would translate it into stitches and colors. By December 1944, news reached the camp through the hidden radio that American forces had landed on Leyte, beginning the reconquest of the Philippines. The internees' spirits soared, but so did the tension. Some guards became more brutal, taking out their fear and anger on the prisoners. Others, like Hayashi, seemed to withdraw into themselves, perhaps contemplating what the future might hold. Dorothy worked on her Afghan with renewed urgency, knowing that the information it contained would be valuable to American forces planning their assault on Manila. She had now encoded the locations of at least 7 major ammunition storage sites, detailed guard rotation schedules for all 3 shifts, structural information about the camp's buildings and fences, and even information about the morale and disposition of different units of guards. The Afghan measured nearly 4 meters long, folded into a bulky square that Dorothy kept in a battered canvas bag. In early January 1945, the character of the camp changed dramatically. Most of the regular guards were pulled out for frontline duty, replaced by older men, and those too injured for combat operations. Supplies dwindled to almost nothing. The internees organized themselves to share what little food they had, creating soup kitchens that stretched their meager rations as far as possible. Dorothy contributed her portion to the common pot, working on her knitting, even as hunger made her vision occasionally blur. Sergeant Hayashi found her one evening in late January, his expression grim. "American forces are close," he said quietly. "Perhaps 2 weeks away, maybe less. There will be a final inspection tomorrow. Hide your work well." Dorothy nodded. "Thank you for the warning." Hayashi hesitated, then spoke again. "When they come, stay away from the main gate. There are orders to move prisoners before the camp is liberated. Orders I do not agree with but cannot countermand." He met her eyes. "Hide, if you can. The southern section near the damaged wall. That is your best chance." The next day's inspection was thorough and brutal. Guards tore through the dormitories, confiscating anything that looked remotely like documentation or communication equipment. They found and destroyed 3 hidden radios, and the prisoners who had been operating them were taken away. Dorothy watched from near the acacia tree, her canvas bag hidden beneath a loose board in the floor of the building that housed the camp's makeshift school. But the inspection passed, and Dorothy's Afghan remained undiscovered. She retrieved it that night, checking carefully to ensure every stitch was intact. Ellen found her there in the darkness, both women too tired and too anxious to sleep. "It's almost over," Ellen whispered. "One way or another, this is almost finished." Dorothy ran her fingers over the complex pattern of stitches, feeling the texture of the information she had preserved. 3 years, she said softly. 3 years of watching and recording and hoping it would matter, hoping we'd live long enough to see them use it. "We will," Ellen said with more confidence than Dorothy felt. "We've come too far to fail now." The next 2 weeks were among the longest of Dorothy's life. American artillery could be heard in the distance, growing closer each day. The guards grew increasingly nervous, some abandoning their posts entirely to flee south. Hayashi remained at his position, maintaining order among the remaining guards and preventing the kind of last-minute atrocities that had occurred at other camps. On February 3, 1945, in the early morning hours, Dorothy was awakened by the sound of distant gunfire, closer than she had ever heard it. She grabbed her canvas bag and ran to find Ellen, who was already awake, helping to organize the other women. "It's starting," Ellen said simply. "Stay close to me." The next hours were chaos. Guards ran through the compound, shouting contradictory orders. Some demanded that prisoners gather at the main gate for evacuation. Others simply fled. Dorothy and Ellen, along with about 30 other prisoners, followed Hayashi's advice and moved to the southern section of the camp, where a section of wall had been damaged by bombing months earlier and never fully repaired. They huddled there as the sounds of battle grew closer, American artillery and Japanese defensive fire creating a terrible symphony. Dorothy clutched her canvas bag to her chest, protecting 3 years of intelligence gathering that might no longer matter if they were all destroyed in the crossfire. The breakthrough came just before dawn. American forces, moving faster than the Japanese defenders had expected, punched through the defenses south of Santo Tomas and reached the camp's perimeter. Dorothy heard English voices shouting orders, and for a moment she could not process that the voices were real, that liberation had actually arrived. The first American soldier through the gap in the southern wall was a young lieutenant from California, covered in dust and carrying a Thompson submachine gun. He stopped short when he saw the group of emaciated prisoners staring at him with expressions of disbelief. "U.S. Army, 1st Cavalry Division," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "You're safe now. You're going home." Ellen Winters, dignified even in her ragged clothes, stepped forward. "Lieutenant," she said calmly, "I am Ellen Winters, civilian internee. This is Lieutenant Dorothy Chen, Army Nurse Corps. She has intelligence information that your commanding officers will want to see. Immediately." Within hours, Dorothy found herself sitting across a table from a Colonel James Mitchell, an intelligence officer who had landed with the assault forces. She carefully unfolded the massive Afghan, spreading it across the table in all its garish, confusing glory. "Colonel," she began, "this is a coded map of the entire Santo Tomas compound, including guard positions, supply depots, ammunition storage, structural vulnerabilities, and detailed notes on enemy force disposition." She pulled out a sheet of paper where she had hastily written out the decryption key. Each stitch type represents a different category of information. The colors correspond to geographic locations within the camp. The sequences of stitches encode measurements, times, and quantities. Colonel Mitchell stared at the Afghan, then at Dorothy, then back at the Afghan. "Lieutenant," he said slowly, "you're telling me that you hid military intelligence in a knitting project?" "Yes, sir, for nearly 3 years." "And the guards never suspected?" "One did. Sergeant Takashi Hayashi." Dorothy met the colonel's eyes. "He protected the project, sir, and he protected the prisoners. When American forces arrived, he maintained order and prevented atrocities. I'm formally requesting that this be noted in his record." Mitchell made a note. "We'll investigate that claim. Right now, I need you to walk me through this entire map. We're still clearing parts of Manila, and any intelligence about Japanese positions and resources is valuable." For the next 6 hours, Dorothy decoded her Afghan for American intelligence officers, explaining the meaning of every color choice, every stitch pattern, every seemingly random mistake. The information proved invaluable, providing detailed intelligence about Japanese defensive preparations throughout Manila that helped American forces minimize civilian casualties as they completed the liberation of the city. Ellen Winters sat beside her through most of the debriefing, occasionally adding details from her observations. When they finally finished, both women were exhausted but satisfied. "Someone remembered," Ellen said quietly. "We made sure someone remembered." In the weeks following the liberation, Dorothy learned that over 3,000 internees had survived Santo Tomas, sustained by hope and by the kind of quiet resistance that her knitting project represented. She also learned that Sergeant Hayashi had been captured by American forces during the final assault and was being held for processing as a prisoner of war. Dorothy filed a formal statement detailing Hayashi's actions, testifying that he had protected prisoners, warned them of dangers, and maintained humane treatment even when it put him at personal risk. Her testimony, supported by statements from Ellen and dozens of other internees, ensured that Hayashi was classified as a non-combatant guard who had fulfilled his duties in accordance with the rules of warfare. He was repatriated to Japan in 1946 and later testified at the Tokyo war crimes trials about conditions in Philippine prison camps. The Afghan itself became something of a legend in military intelligence circles. It was photographed extensively, used as a teaching example in cryptography courses, and eventually donated to the National Archives, where it remains today, a testament to one woman's determination to turn something as simple as knitting into a tool of resistance and documentation. Dorothy returned to the United States in April 1945, medically discharged due to the effects of her internment. She weighed barely 43 kilograms, suffered from malnutrition-related health issues, and had chronic pain from injuries sustained during the camp's final chaotic days. But she carried with her something more valuable than her own health, a complete record of what had happened in Santo Tomas, preserved in every carefully placed stitch. She spent the rest of 1945 recovering at a military hospital in San Francisco, where she was visited by intelligence officers who wanted to learn more about her encoding methods. "They're talking about recommending you for a commendation," one major told her. "What you did was extraordinary." Dorothy, sitting in a hospital bed with the California sun streaming through the window, shook her head slightly. "What I did was necessary." She paused, looking out at the city where she had been born 42 years earlier. Somebody needed to remember. Somebody needed to bear witness. "That's all I did." But it was not all she did. In 1946, Dorothy testified before a congressional committee investigating conditions in Japanese prison camps, bringing with her not just her memories, but the physical evidence of her Afghan, now mounted and preserved behind glass. She walked the committee members through the code, showing them how she had transformed observation into art, intelligence into craft. The committee's final report credited Dorothy's work with providing crucial intelligence that helped American forces plan their assault on Manila with precision that minimized civilian casualties. It also acknowledged the role played by Ellen Winters and the other internees who had contributed to the intelligence-gathering effort. Ellen, who had returned to Ohio after the war, wrote to Dorothy regularly. They maintained a correspondence for the next 40 years, letters filled with observations about birds and gardening, and the small details of life that they had learned to treasure during their time in Santo Tomas. Every year, on February 3rd, the anniversary of their liberation, they would call each other, sharing memories that grew less painful with time but never less important. Dorothy never married and never had children of her own, but she became a mentor to younger women entering military service, teaching them that strength comes in many forms and that sometimes the most powerful act of resistance is simply refusing to let truth be erased. She taught nursing at a community college in San Francisco for 20 years, and in her spare time, she taught knitting classes at a local community center. Her students often remarked on the unusual patterns she taught, complex designs that seemed to have no practical purpose. She never told them that embedded in those patterns were codes and methods for preserving information, skills that she hoped would never be needed, but that she felt compelled to pass on nonetheless. Sergeant Takashi Hayashi returned to Kyoto after his repatriation and worked for the rest of his life as a textile inspector in the same factory where his mother had worked before the war. He and Dorothy exchanged a single letter in 1953 in which he thanked her for her testimony and expressed his hope that the years of war had taught all of them the value of small acts of humanity in the midst of systematic inhumanity. Dorothy kept that letter until her death, stored in a small box along with the only photograph she had from Santo Tomas, a grainy image showing her sitting beneath the acacia tree, knitting needles in hand, creating something that looked like chaos but was actually perfect order. When Dorothy Chen died in 1992 at the age of 79, her obituary in the San Francisco Chronicle briefly mentioned her service as a prisoner of war and her post-war career in nursing education. It did not mention the Afghan or the intelligence work, or the 3 years she spent transforming knitting into cryptography. That part of her story remained classified until 1998, when the intelligence community declassified documents related to World War II covert operations in the Pacific Theater. Today, Dorothy's Afghan hangs in the National Cryptologic Museum in Maryland, displayed alongside other examples of creative intelligence gathering from the Second World War. The placard beneath it reads, "Improvised Intelligence Tool, Santo Tomas Internment Camp, 1942 to 1945, created by U.S. Army Nurse Corps Lieutenant Dorothy Chen, used to encode and preserve military intelligence under enemy observation for 36 months." But that dry description fails to capture what the Afghan really represents. It is a monument to patience and observation, to the power of maintaining hope when circumstances seem hopeless, to the importance of bearing witness even when it seems no one will survive to see that witness matter. Every stitch in that chaotic, colorful pattern represents a choice Dorothy made, to resist through documentation, to fight through preservation, to ensure that someone would remember. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.